Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG podcast series. My name is Pamela Cohn, and I am delighted to host this series. And today we have with us Loes van Dijk of the Netherlands. She is the founder of Climate Court. She is a climate impact ambassador to the EU, and she works in climate litigation and law, constantly striving towards climate justice. Hello, Luce. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. Thanks for having me today.
I should share with the audience that you and I met recently at the Legal ESG Benelux event back in September when you were so gracious to serve on the faculty and share some of your expertise with the audience. It was very, very well received. So let's share with our audience today. Tell me about your career and how you came to found Climate Court.
Yeah, sure. So my background is in corporate law. I studied in the UK and I pursued the legal training there as well. And as I was studying, I had an amazing lecturer in corporate social responsibility, and that really inspired me to think about how companies can change from the inside out. And I even pursued that as well after university for a couple of years. I worked in that field and I thought a lot about how companies can do better aside from regulations. Where is the baseline and how can you make sure that they voluntarily pursue something that's good for everyone?
Mhm.
And then at some point, I came across climate litigation, and at the time that was really growing. In the Netherlands, it's very big. So I got really interested in it, and I struggled to really find a lot of information online, to be honest. There's some really, really good databases out there, but I think I was looking for a little bit more of a legal aspect to it and the legal analysis of these cases. So that's why I started Climate Court 2 years ago now. And what I do is I really go in depth in what is going on in climate litigation across the world. I really take care to also include cases from the global south to make sure that we highlight what is happening there as well, especially because they have a very different kind of climate litigation, but equally as effective.
Mhm.
So that's what I do now in my day to day. I really try to get more attention to on these climate litigation cases, regardless where they're coming from.
And so you do all the research, gather all this information, and put it all together. How do people like me or our listeners access that? Where would we find all the work that you're doing, and how do we get access to it?
I have a website. It's climate-court.com, and
Mhm.
that has everything accessible online. But I also have a free newsletter where you can just sign up, and then every week you get very short snippets of these are the cases, this is the country that the case is from. And that weekly update is also shared on my LinkedIn, where I've met a lot of really amazing people that are working in legal climate or climate litigation, and they all are very keen to follow it, regardless of their occupation. I think companies, NGOs, regulators are all keeping an eye on it.
Well, to your point, it's a full-time job to keep track of all the litigation that's going on around the world with respect to climate. So tell me, you said you've been working in this space. Well, you've started Climate Court 2 years ago.
Yeah.
What are the trends that you're seeing? That's a really big question, I know, but compare it to when you first got started. What seem to be the trends in this space?
Yeah, so I'll frame my answer for mostly for corporates and what they can
Mhm.
see as well. And what I see is that right now corporations are really far from where they need to be to prevent climate litigation. I find that surprising often, but the governance structures are too weak to really anticipate climate litigation. So boards aren't really overseeing the ESG risk that is out there. Supply chains aren't really mapped. Disclosures aren't really backed by evidence or by robust systems. And even worse, so what I see a lot is that climate-related disclosures or reports are still done by marketing departments, or they're treated as some sort of tick box operation where there's nothing really backing the actions. So to preface the trends that I'm seeing is that I think what's lacking right now is that litigation risk isn't seen as a risk in and of itself for climate, and it's not just about what companies say in their reports, but it's about what they're actually doing. And
Hmm.
there's currently a big gap between ambition, disclosures, their actions, and that's where the climate litigation is starting to come in. So the trends, to answer the question I'm seeing, are, first of all, the most obvious one is the direct corporate liability cases where claims are being filed against companies in over emissions, over greenwashing, over disclosures, and increasingly also about the entire supply chain. And that supply chain due diligence is really becoming more and more central because there's these transnational cases being filed from the global south, and companies are being asked to understand and mitigate risks far beyond their direct operations in where they're headquartered, and really to see what's happening across the world. So that's the second one. The third one I would say is what I already kind of hinted at, is that the governance of companies is really under the spotlight. So courts and regulators, they're really paying attention to what boards and senior executives are doing and how they're managing risk, aside from just talking about the risk, but what are they doing about it? And this all comes together into scenario planning, I would say. So climate risk integration is no longer really optional. It's not a voluntary action. The firms really need to embed that ESG strategy into their core operational
Hmm.
strategy to really survive litigation, but also regulation that's coming.
And so when you talk about these cases that are being brought, who's bringing these cases? Who's filing them?
It's very broad who's bringing them. So there's the most attention-grabbing ones are usually filed by NGOs, I would say, because they turn it into a big campaign as well. So there's a
Hmm.
lot of marketing involved in that. But aside from the NGOs, there's also individuals. So people like you and I who are just seeing something that's impacting them, and they try to set up a case. And that can be people in Europe or in the US, but it can also be people in the global south. So that's the second group. And I would say it's less climate litigation, but regulators are increasingly starting to enforce. And
Hmm.
that's another one to watch at the moment. Yeah.
What do you think are the biggest challenges for companies that, as you described, have to address this and perhaps reshape their governance structures, make sure that ESG risk is embedded in their strategy sessions, make sure it's a board topic and not a topic of the marketing department? How do companies get there?
I think they really have to start from the basics. I think there's a lack of backing up at the moment of what they're saying they're doing. And I think they need to, from the basic, they need to reframe climate change and climate regulation and climate litigation and all the risks associated with that. They need to reframe that towards something that is embedded into their entire company. So they really need to begin from the start. And doing that requires them to really map out properly what kind of risks they have, not just litigation risk, but any kind of risk related to climate change, whether that's litigation risk or transition risk or insurances or physical risks. And I think companies have started to do that, but it's really important that they continue on that and that they continue to map that out and then assign properly who is responsible within the company and within the structures for that risk. And to also be aware that that responsibility might be bigger than they are anticipating. For example, I touched upon the boards and the executive directors and what their role is and what their potential liability might be in the future if these cases are starting to pick up more. And I think they need to start seeing climate change as something they need to do something about, not from a voluntary perspective, but something that even if regulation is lacking,
Hmm.
something that they need to actively do something about.
Right. So it's not just doing whatever the requirements are to meet regulatory thresholds, but it's
Yep.
actually doing this because it will help their business thrive and survive long term.
Yeah, exactly. I think increasingly there's now academic research into the financial impact of integrating climate change into your business operations and how well these companies are doing that are the front runners. I'm not really that well versed in the financial impacts of it, but I am well versed in the fallout that happens
Mhm.
when they aren't doing it correctly with the litigation. And I think companies are underestimating the impact that litigation can have on their company and on their reputation and on their consumers, their employees. From all angles right now, we're seeing that pushback happening.
Yeah. You mentioned a few litigation topics, but share with us what you think are the top five topics or claims that are being filed in litigation against corporates.
Yeah. The first one, the obvious one that I mentioned, is the direct climate litigation against the corporate, where they are going after a duty of care. So the company owes some sort of duty to whoever they're damaging by not acting properly on climate, not reducing emissions, not. I include in this also greenwashing as well, since this is also it's consumer law, it's not tort law, but it's mostly to do with doing something uh, other than what you're reporting that you're doing. So it's that constant gap of I'm saying this, but I'm actually doing this. So that's greenwashing. That's also the tort law, and that's the biggest one right now that's getting the most attention. I would say that the second one that is becoming more and more important is the transnational cases against corporates. So that those are the cases mostly from the global south where they're suing companies that are headquartered in Europe or in the US, for example, and coming after them in their home country legal systems. So over the past couple of months, we've seen cases from Brazil, from Pakistan, from the Philippines, from Nigeria, from Zambia, and all of these cases are coming after companies that have their supply chains and haven't
Yeah.
don't have a lot of oversight over these supply chains, and there's things happening in these countries through their subsidiaries that they are just not prepared for and often unaware of, but
Mhm.
definitely unprepared for. Another one that I think is big is uh, the cases against directors. They haven't been successful yet, but I do think they're becoming more frequent, and they take two different forms. So on the one hand, you have the civil cases against over fiduciary duties and what is a director supposed to do, and to what extent are they liable for their actions within the company and for the company's actions as well, especially when it's so clear that, as I mentioned, where the actions and the the disclosures aren't matching up,
Mhm.
to what extent does the director carry that risk? And then the second part of that is that there's also now more and more criminal actions against directors. So if they really acted negligently or even willfully, I haven't seen any willful cases yet, but negligence is really becoming big as well. And there are countries that have started prosecuting directors as well. This is mostly still in the environmental space, so not climate per se, but I do expect it's coming towards climate too.
So,
Those are the biggest
yeah.
ones, yeah.
So, unrelated question, because you've mentioned lots of countries, and when we started this conversation, you talked about climate litigation being front and center in the Netherlands. Where
Yeah.
is most of the activity or precedence? Where is that? What countries are leading the pack in that? And I have leading the pack in quotes. So where is most of this litigation taking place?
I think there's a couple of jurisdictions that are doing really well, or at least where there's a lot of activity. So the Netherlands is one of them. I think we started very early on with the Urgenda case against the Dutch government. That was what I see as a model of climate litigation against governments worldwide because it's being cited in different cases and not just cited, but from what I see, the entire model of climate litigation against the government is modeled after that Urgenda case.
Hmm.
So Netherlands is definitely big, and they're moving more towards the litigation against corporates now. So they have still ongoing case against Shell. There's a case against ING coming, and these are really big cases that everyone's kind of watching as well.
Hmm.
I think if you're still focusing on the global north, secondly, the United States has a lot of activity, but it's obviously given the current political climate, it's extremely difficult for the groups there that are
Hmm. Hmm.
engaged in litigation, but they have successes still, and they're still winning and they're still fighting. And I am a little bit worried about cases that are moving towards the Supreme Court and that are currently having a lot of Trump administration involvement as well. And I hope that they can survive it, especially if it doesn't move to the Supreme Court yet. So it's again, it's a very different kind of climate litigation because it's forced into an area where they really don't want to argue because it's constantly being pushed towards, oh, this is a federal matter. No, it's a state matter.
Right.
And they're not even talking about climate anymore at that point. So that's a big one. Germany is huge, I would say. They're very active as well. And that is a country where they are starting to focus more on directors as well and liability and criminal liability as well. So that's one to watch for sure. And big on greenwashing too.
Hmm.
And then in the global south, I would say South Africa is doing really well, the groups there. Nigeria. And in Nigeria, the focus is mostly on divestment at the moment. So companies, oil companies that were there and that suddenly pick up, move to a different country, but leave behind a huge environmental disaster. And communities there are really trying to get justice over this, and they're pretty active. And those are the transnational cases that I talked about as well, because these cases are being fought in Dutch court, in UK courts currently. So that's a great country to watch. Mm, I think, to be honest, there's a lot of countries with amazing and beautiful cases, but these ones are the ones that keep popping up most frequently, I would say.
Hmm. So on the ESG front, what do you think is in store for 2020? We're almost at the end of 2020. So let's say 2026 and beyond. What are you going to see next year?
So, climate litigation wise, I would
Yeah.
say it's going to increase really exponentially. I think new legal theories will constantly be applied and existing precedent will be expanded upon. And one thing that I think is becoming more obvious to me is that litigation is increasingly turning now towards financial markets. So we're going to be seeing cases against banks. I mentioned the one that's coming against ING, cases involving insurance, and so on. And for example, a recent update from Europe is that I think 2 days ago, the European Central Bank, they started fining banks that aren't sufficiently documenting climate-related risks. So there's really the pressure on the on the financial sector is really, really beginning. On a personal level, for Climate Court, the organization I founded, company, is that we introduced a subscription model. And
Oh.
I started that a month ago. And I'm really, really positively surprised with how well it's going. And we're giving people access to a lot more of the legal analysis that I mentioned at the start that I was missing myself. So it's more about the legal elements of the case, the arguments, what kind of science is used and referred to, how how does one case relate to other cases, for example. So it's more in depth and more focused, but
Mhm.
we're still sticking also to the updates. So we're offering different tools and different ways of keeping up with climate litigation. And me personally, I'm also because I have very comfortably been in the position where I am kind of in between the plaintiffs and the defendants because of my corporate law background, I can understand the companies and the structures and why it's sometimes very difficult to make certain decisions or actions. But I also speak a lot with the NGOs, for example, that are bringing these cases. And because I was in this very comfortable position, I've now developed with an attorney in the Netherlands. We're starting a practice together to help. corporates and companies understand how to prepare for these kind of risks and how to restructure that governance and what role climate litigation plays in that and how they can actively prevent being a defendant in one of these cases by really having a properly set up governance structure. So those are my personal updates.
Well, that sounds like 2026 is going to be a very exciting year. I want to go back to your subscription model. Where do our listeners subscribe?
So that's the website climate-court.com.
Okay.
And it should be obvious from there on out, but if
Okay.
they have any questions, they can always reach out.
Okay, wonderful. So my final question of all of my podcast guests, especially in this tumultuous, challenging time for ESG, and I'm, going to admit, particularly in the US, what gives you hope doing this work?
So I draw my hope from very small and personal things. I really like spending time in nature by myself, just really looking at nature as it
Hmm.
shows what could be lost and how lucky I am to still have nature to enjoy and not to have to worry about my surroundings yet.
Yeah.
And I also draw motivation from my loved ones, from my close family members. I have very young nieces and nephews that are gonna have a future that might look different from what our world looks like currently.
Hmm.
But beyond that personal dynamic, I would say that I'm very, very motivated by the the innovation coming from the global south currently. So communities that are really taking very bold and very creative action against climate change despite their limited resources. So for example, that the recent effort in bringing the issue of climate change to the International Court of Justice and seeing the difference that that made and the hope that that gave people, I think that in turn really inspires me as well. And I also often receive messages from lawyers in the Global South, and they tell me that my work has really benefited their cases and really helped them do research. And those are very proud moments for me. And then I get motivated and hopeful to keep going and to hopefully, even though it's a very tiny, tiny share, to really help people make a difference.
Well, it's obvious to me by the number of followers you have on LinkedIn that a lot of people are finding your summations and your newsletters very, very helpful. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights with us today. We have been delighted to have you, and I hope to have you back in a year's time, and we'll check on progress on all of those things. Thank you
That would
so
be
much,
amazing.
Liz. Okay,
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
my pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.